Tonight, as I said, we have with us Jessica Murray, an astrologer, author, cultural commentator. She's highly regarded for her mastery of astrology, and you can visit her at www.mothersky.com, where you can discover the innovative Skywatch service, which lets you track current cosmic conditions and plan your day accordingly. Jessica's the author of Soul Stagnation and At the Crossroads, and she has contributed to an anthology called Transpersonal Astrology. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Jessica. Hi, how are you?
Hello, Stephen. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. Welcome back to Psychic Viewpoint.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
Well, we certainly have a lot to cover tonight, so let's go ahead and hop into it. Let's start out with Christmas itself. What are its origins?
Wow.
That's a big question.
I mean, this is a holiday everybody feels, isn't it? Despite, all the clashes about belief systems. But you know that astrology looks at these things as based on natural cycles. So for us, it all boils down to what the seasons were doing. And the original holidays were festivals that marked specific seasonal shifts, in the northern hemisphere anyway, that divided up the year. And they were all based on agriculture. They used an agricultural reference point. And so, they used nature, and they had some things that were eternal for them. They used the sky as their main calendar. And they had I'm thinking particularly of the Wheel of the Year in the Celtic tradition, where Yule was the winter solstice when the sun was born. And, S-U-N, the sun started its cycle to come back. And heat and light began to increase again. And somewhere along the line, you notice it got turned into a sun, S-O-N, in some stories that got told about the solstice, like the Christian one.
Very interesting. I think we forget how important the sun was to ancient peoples who really had modern science. I mean, how did we know back then, if we lived then, that the sun was going to come back from day to day? We had no scientific guarantee.
I think that is such a good point. I think that's the root of this business of hope and faith that you hear about in Christianity surrounding Christmas. It's really the hope that the light will return. Because like you say, in the pre-modern world, they didn't have their little digital calendars and their little smartphones to tell them that there was any certainty at all that life was going to continue. And winter pretty much meant death, unless you were prepared, for denizens of the northern hemisphere. And I think that also the physical and psycho-spiritual withdrawal into the cave during winter and moving slowly and conserving what you'd put by, waiting for the light to return. I think it all had this biological reality of winter that we've lost, but that they used to celebrate. And you're right. I mean, how could you not celebrate Yule if it was the moment when a dead world was going to be redeemed by this glorious return to life?
Well, you once described the winter solstice to me in a really wonderful way, the light getting ready to pivot. And seeing as how the winter solstice appears to be the sort of agent that makes Christmas special for everybody, Yule or whatever holiday you celebrate. What is the solstice for those of us who might not know?
Well, it comes from sol is the root, which is sun, and sistere is Latin for to stand still. So solstice is when the sun seems to stand still, when it seems to pause before turning around. It's all a geocentric illusion, It's what humans perceive from Earth's point of view. But that's where the meaning lies in this view. It's what appears to us to be reality. So, in an astronomical sense, the winter solstice, is when the relative yearly path of the sun perpendicular to the horizon stops and reverses direction. It's gone progressively further south of the equator, further and further, And when it reaches that most southerly point, that's when winter officially begins, again in the northern hemisphere. And we start to get this sense of the period of darkness turning into light. And we honor it as the shortest day of the year because it's that turning point. But you know, what's interesting to astrologers, more than the astronomy of it, and to anybody who does ritual, is that it's also a turnaround in an esoteric sense, because light is symbolic of consciousness.
That's very profound, and I think you just struck at the heart of the whole issue here. Consciousness. Christmas makes us more conscious of the material side of things because we all seem to get more acquisitive during Christmas, you know. But yet, it's also such a spiritual time of the year as well. And so, I like how you describe that. How it's sort of a pivot point also of the consciousness as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's really striking. All about that, and something you said earlier strikes me as the whole point of it, which is that idea of hope, that it wasn't a guarantee that the light would come back. And so this correlates to the fact that the sign Sagittarius, which is the sign of belief, is what's going on for most of December every year in the Northern Hemisphere. This coldest, darkest moment of the calendar year is 2/3 of it is about the sign of belief. And you have Sagittarians in your audience maybe that know this very well, that it's the sign that seeks meaning and asks the big questions of life. And you know, just by the by, we had a very interesting transit from 1994 to 2008 when Pluto, the most powerful transit in the sky, was passing through Sagittarius. And it was then that the world's religions, or the world's dominant sky god religions, really entered a dicey period. You know what I mean? Those three established religions, Christianity,
yes,
Judaism, and Islam, they all entered periods of crisis when Pluto was in Sagittarius.
Right, and now also we have, I believe, transiting Mars and Jupiter that are configuring into what's going on with Pluto right now as well, no?
Right. As Pluto has gone into Capricorn now. It made that switch in 2008. And that's part of a big old transit system that I call the Cardinal Cross, which is, it's all astrologers are talking about. It's very dominant. It marks out this era that we're in. And the biggest player in this transit system is Pluto in Capricorn. And, shall we say a little bit about the cross?
Absolutely.
In case people want to be reminded. All the equinoxes and solstices since Pluto made that switch have been explosive because they've triggered the longest arm of that cross, the Uranus-Pluto square. There were all these world-altering events that happened on the spring and fall equinoxes and on the winter and summer solstice. Buto, that was the first one that hit me, that this was going to be the pattern, because that was the winter solstice of 2008 when she was assassinated.
The Prime Minister of Pakistan, right?
Say it again?
The Prime Minister of Pakistan, right? Okay.
Yeah. And then we had the BP oil disaster, which was the summer solstice of 2010. That was huge, because they were all hitting the early degrees of this cardinal cross, which was occupying the signs that Uranus and Pluto are in. And I think that we need to look at Pluto in Capricorn as the most intense player. I read a lot about this. I have a whole book on just that one square. It's so key a way to understand our era. Capricorn is the sign of the idea of civilization, no less. So that means, and Pluto is the planet of death and rebirth. Mm-hmm. So we're talking about the whole idea of civilization breaking down.
It's frightening but beautiful all at the same time, I dare say.
I think that's true,
The
Stephen.
re-
We have.
the
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say
Go
the
ahead.
regeneration of it, of course, is attractive, but the breakdown part of it probably won't be attractive.
It's easier to take, I think, when we back up and look at how it's played out before. It's easier to read, for example, about history and something like how the British used to, when they were ruling the world, the last great empire. When in the 19th century, the British, their idea of civilization was to, get the people in Africa to wear good English tweed trousers or something. And we look at that and we kind of laugh, right? So
Right.
we're looking at civilization now. It's harder to see our assumptions about what civilization is, but it's not hard to see that, it's breaking down. I mean, our government is utterly dysfunctional, and a
Right.
lot
Well,
of the. Mm-hmm.
I was just going to say, I
Say
think I
again.
read somewhere that Pluto's effects are very subtle anyway, powerful yet buried and subtle.
Yeah, because they take
Yeah.
so long to happen. I mean, it's a 250 years worth of, in this case, notions about what makes a country civilized is what's breaking down right now. And we're talking about a very natural cycle, a process of decay. It's very organic. It happens to the food that you leave out too long in the fruit basket. And then we can look at it and say, well, that makes sense. It's just grown toxic and it's being exposed and it has to go. But when we're in a society where our institutions are having that happen to them, it's much harder to take.
Absolutely. And we also have this Mars transit, which is, and this is passing through during the Christmas season this year. What sort of effect do you think, and we're speculating here, I understand, what sort of effect do you think that might have on people in the holiday season this year?
Well, Mars is the most quickly moving planet of that whole system we were talking about. So you've got basically 4 different pieces of the cardinal cross. And it sounds, its meaning is just like it sounds. It's like we're being crucified energetically. And we really do need to see this as a geometrical thing that's going on and understand it abstractly in order to see what it's about. Mars is sort of the trigger because it comes around as the last little piece of the picture, sort of like the second hand on a clock is the one that catches up to the others that are already in place. If anybody can remember analog clocks, that's my analogy.
I remember them.
And Mars is, go ahead.
Oh, I remember them. I was just going to say Mars is like the second hand on this doohickey, right? And when he hits a certain place on the clock face,
that's right.
boom, boom.
Then we hear the chimes. And Uranus and Pluto are the ones that have the hands of the clock, as it were, that have been there for the longest. And they're actually in their peak period from 2012 to 2015. But when Mars, which moves much more quickly, kind of spins around and catches up with where they are to make this grand cross, and Jupiter's in there on the other side of the thing. Actually, on Christmas Day, Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, Mars is going to oppose Uranus. It's really started now with the intense period that astrologers have been looking at for the solstice season started at the full moon the other day. But it has this series of peaks. So the Mars is going to do its number with Uranus, Christmas and the day before, and Mercury will be in there. And then Mars will square Pluto exactly on the 30th and 31st of December. But you're asking more what it means, I think. And I think that we have to back up and realize that from the point of view of the most meaningful piece of that cross, which is the Pluto and Capricorn piece, which is a long, like you said, slow, gradual process of breakdown leading to renewal. And it's the one that demands the most perspective from us because we get spooked when we see something dying, even if it's something that's horribly riddled with toxicity like the U.S. Congress. But you have to look, I think, from this big historical viewpoint and look at the things that Capricorn means, which are government and corporations and rules and bureaucracies and boundaries. And then you look at what Uranus means, which is challenging all these Plutonian things. Uranus is really people power at its best,
Right.
At its highest. It also means technology and a lot of the other things which have a shadow side as well as a fabulous side. But this clash, the intensity of this clash, is meant to be just taking us through this period by the short hairs. There's no way we could have avoided it. It's just an intense period.
So not only will this Mars transit sort of electrify the Christmas season, but we're also kicking off 2014 perhaps with maybe some insurgencies in different parts of the world perhaps,
yes,
or there'll be something
right.
of that nature.
That's right. And insurgency is a wonderful Uranian concept, the idea of people rising up relatively suddenly, relative to, the 84 years of a Uranus cycle. The insurgencies that we've had since Uranus went into Aries and joined this transit have been relatively abrupt and surprising, and that's part of their power. So every time there's a peak, I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time. Did you say something?
Oh, no, that wasn't me. I apologize.
Okay, that was some other noise.
Right.
When there's a peak in this long-running transit, those are the times when astrologers kind of put the yellow highlighter around the date. And one of those peaks, like you're saying, is now, this solstice season, the end of 2013. We're going to have another set of peaks in January, but I think that the biggest one for 2014 is going to be in April, in the spring. And that's when we're going to have the Grand Cross is going to be a coalescing of a bunch of different planets in the sky. And Americans especially are going to be kept on the edge of their seats because the way that the cross will relate to the chart of the USA is very tight. The entity that was born July 4th, 1776, it has a chart too. And it's going to fit in with this cardinal cross very strongly in April.
So yes, you're talking about the Sibley chart, which we discussed on July the 4th. So you're saying there's
That's
almost like
right.
a synastry between these two, between the Sibley chart and
Yeah.
this Grand Cross.
That's
Okay.
right. And I have an article on Daykeeper Journal that comes out next month for people who want more detail. But a lot of astrologers are talking about it. Bill Herbst has a wonderful article in the current Mountain Astrologer. The part of the Sibley chart, I won't go into too much detail because I could ramble on this one. It has a real weak spot that, we could call it the group soul of the USA, and that's the sun that squares Saturn in that chart. And that's the very part of the chart that's going to be highlighted by the Grand Cross this spring.
That's very interesting. It's almost as if the very ego of the nation is going to be turned against the government. Or because that square involves the 10th house in the Sibley chart, doesn't it? Because Saturn is in the 10th house, right?
That's right. That is one way that it could play out. And I think it's very hopeful to a lot of people. But the idea of the people, capital P, this is the heart and soul of the notion of democracy. And so Uranus is said to govern democracy for that reason, of the people, by the people, for the people. Beautiful ideal that's enshrined in the USA chart from different things, different details in the chart. But now, Pluto, no surprise, governs plutocracy. And Pluto is square to Uranus in the sky for everybody, for all countries. So the whole notion of plutocracy versus people power. Mm-hmm. And that includes shining a light on the awful corruptions that are happening, not just here, but I think that the USA is going to be kind of a poster child for for these revelations.
Well, I do believe you mentioned that Mars is going to be forming an opposition to Uranus, correct? Did I get that right?
On Christmas.
Well,
And it's staying in Libra for a long time because it's going retrograde. So it's going to go back and forth across these critical degrees.
So this is going to be stretched out for a while because it'll be going backwards and putting it forward again, then putting it in reverse, perhaps.
That's right.
I see.
Yeah.
Well, I've always sort of read that the opposition aspect represented like an avoidance of something. So, might we speculate that if Uranus is in opposition to bloody Mars, that this might be sort of like a bloodless type of insurrection, a lot of protesting, perhaps, but without actually crossing the line into violence? Would we be able to speculate?
I don't know. I really don't know. I think that all the elements are in there. Mars does govern war, but it is in Libra. So, I mean, it's in Libra in the sky right now. So that is kind of a signature of negotiation. It's a very ambivalent placement, though, because it does have to do with aggression and putting the will forward, even in a collective, which is what we're talking about at the moment, that a whole group would have this vibe. But in Libra, it tries to work things out. It struggles with the reasoned argument and so on. I think that we could see a low-level version of Mars in Libra coming out in the U.S., sphere, and these dreadful so-called debates that people have. The idea of a debate is Libran, but the reality, when you have unconscious ego behind it, as we know when we look at the Democrats and Republicans, they aren't really debates at all. You see, so everything depends on the level of consciousness of the people.
Right. Yes, because a lot of those debates just turn into filibustering, and they're just useless consumption of time for no really constructive purpose.
Right. Nonsense. But what the transit will do is cast the light upon it. That's what I'm looking at, not so much that it's going to resolve anything. Because like you said, the process of decay and regeneration is slow and drawn out for a reason. It's natural law. But it's going to, for sure, shine a light on these things. It's all about, kind of making the group, in this case, making a running leap of consciousness, like happened when the Julian Assange let loose with WikiLeaks, and then the NSA thing, which had been going on for years, but suddenly it was front page, and suddenly it was part of the public conversation. And
it's
that's
a big
what
deal
we're seeing
now.
Here. Yeah.
Huh, that's very interesting. Now, we've seen so far how the Christmas season is rooted in the sacredness of the solstice. We've talked a little bit about some of the quote-unquote Christmas signs, such as Sagittarius and Capricorn, and what's going on with those two signs today. What can we do as moderns to reclaim the spirituality of the solstice and sort of embody what it originally meant, sort of get back out of what's so popularly called the consumer orgy that it has become in modern Christmas in the United States?
Yeah, I think that's what this is really all about, Stephen. I mean, for consciousness seekers to plug into the deeper meaning of these seasonal shifts, which are marked by the equinoxes and the solstices, and you don't have to be an astrologer to track them. I think it's what's extraordinary is that more people don't go by them, because I think that it's cellular memory. I say go by them. I mean even pay attention to the fact that you feel on a body level like curling up with a good book in bed and going to bed earlier when it's dark and cold outside. And I think that we all feel these things as animals, and that it's a sort of a testament of how disconnected we've become. If we can't even pay attention to this most primal impulse anymore, the idea of bounding up from the Thanksgiving dinner table to go shopping in the pre-dawn. I mean, I don't know what I'm talking about, really. But I've read a lot about the Black Friday thing, and it sounds so perverse that, you can hardly imagine a more ironic thing to become an institution at a time like this. So I guess what I'm saying is I'm complaining about how we have gotten out of touch, which is the answer to your question, is to go back to the primal meaning, to notice how we're cut off in the developed Western world, but then to get into imagining that, if you had been a pre-modern person in a tribe where the warmth and the heat were steadily ebbing, and you'd been watching animals and plant life slow down and go dormant, and then your shaman or your priestess gave you this story, this beautiful legend about a return. Mm-hmm. This back to the hope and faith we're talking about. And if you think that we do retain in our DNA somewhere, what Jung would have called it in the collective unconscious, that we retain a memory of that physical reality, life and death reality for millennia, mm-hmm. then I don't think it's hard to tune in again to this magnificent concept, which is true in a natural sense, that the winter solstice is announced by this imperceptible spark in the dark of light returning, and to celebrate it, even if you just do it privately with a candle.
Absolutely. And Christianity gives its congregants and believers the assurance that, for a time at least, the sun is nailed to the cross of reality, and we know where the sun is at least temporarily.
Right.
It's going to go away
mm-hmm.
again, but it promises to come back. And that's one aspect of the Christmas saga we're going to get into when we come back from commercial, is the idea of redemption and getting a second chance to start over again. But right now we're going to take a 1-minute commercial. I'd like to remind everybody, if they would like to book a consultation with Jessica Murray, you can find her at www.mothersky.com. Thank you very much. We will be right back.
A new era in psychic services has begun. PsychicAccess.com. You can connect with our psychic advisors by telephone or chat 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. All of our psychic advisors are interviewed, fully verified, and accuracy tested, assuring you quality service. We're living in some very troubled times right now. More and more, the world's problems are affecting us on a personal level. You don't have to deal with this alone. Our highly accurate psychics, caring advisors, and talented mediums can help with situations you are currently experiencing and can let you know what the future may hold for you. All new customers get a free 6-minute reading. All you have to do is register. Why not visit us now and get a free reading at PsychicAccess.com.
Thank you very much, and welcome back to Psychic Viewpoint. Tonight we have with us, for our 200th show anniversary, Jessica Murray. And we are speaking about the spirituality, the spiritual roots of Christmas. And before we went to commercial break, we were talking about how to sort of reconnect with the spiritual origins of the winter solstice. And Jessica, you had some lovely comments about that, how to sort of reclaim Christmas as a good season again for us.
Yeah, and I don't think it can be done, Stephen, until people get the context of how it started. Like we were talking about earlier, that, holidays, holy days, are based on natural cycles which are real to every human being and animal and plant that inhabits the earth. We're all connected, in other words, naturally to the seasons. We all know what they mean. And back when, if you use the Celtic model, where they had the winter solstice, for them it was the new year. they saw it as the beginning where the sun was born, and they featured it in the pre-sky god era. In the prehistoric religions, they saw it as a great goddess who had this young male god offshoot, and that was him who was born at the winter solstice. He represented the sun, S-U-N, and then we had the next quarter, which was the spring equinox, and then he was in his infancy. They called it Ostara, from which we get Easter. Mm-hmm. And then there was the summer solstice, and the crops were in their prime, and so was the young god in their schema by that point, in the middle of summer. And then they had Mabon, which is the autumn equinox, which you know is a harvest festival. So I think, and then by that time the sun god was diminishing in power, just like the heat and light were diminishing. And then we're back to Yule again, or the winter solstice, another new year. To me, there's such a logic to it. Maybe it's the Taurus in me. But I find it so utterly reasonable and kind of intuitive, a system, that I don't think it's possible to not get it, and to tune into the glory of each of these for what they mean once you get the context.
Christmas used to be an organic holiday with chestnuts roasting on an open fire and all of this good thing. It used to be true to its agricultural roots. And I think what you're saying is that one of the reasons we can't recapture the magic of the solstice is because we've cut ourselves off from the land. We're no longer a part of the land.
I think that's true in so many ways, that we've cut off our nose to spite our face in more ways than one, by deciding that we were separate from the environment. And, Rick Tarnas has a beautiful way of talking about this in The Passion of the Western Mind, how we got separated not only from nature, but from our bodies and sexuality as we went through the Cartesian revolution and so on. But pre-environmental America was not a pretty sight. I'm thinking of the way things were in my childhood, in the 50s and 60s, where we didn't have any sense of ecology. The word hadn't even been coined yet. And, the nature was just scenery, basically.
It's a resource to be used.
Yeah, which it still is in the blinkered industrial mind. But something you were saying about how do we reconnect with what I think our animal natures already know, right, as living beings on the earth. And I think that our collective unconscious remembers too. And what was going on for so many centuries in the human race was that our emotional and psychological states of mind matched up with what was going on with the seasons. There was a match. And so I don't think it's that hard to reconnect with the natural organicity of the holidays. If you see that, I don't even think you have to be in nature, if you see what I mean. It's not even just a literal thing of being on the land, although that would help. I agree with you. It's also something more subtle than that, which you might call the psychic DNA of human beings.
Right. It can be taken metaphorically as well.
Say it again.
So it can be taken metaphorically as well. If I'm a city dweller, I can still recapture the magic of an organic Christmas that's centered around the solstice, and understand the meaning of that, even if I live in a city.
That's right. I mean, astrologers often, I live in a city, and I rarely see the sky and the planets that I read about in my tables, my lists of degrees. Right. But we're plugged in nonetheless because everything's connected. And I think from an esoteric point of view, this is really what counts. I think that idea you were saying earlier is just a wonderful point, that the trust that's at the core of the meaning of this holiday. And what about its shadow? What about the opposite of that trust? That seems to me to be related to the crisis of faith that so many people go through at this time of year. And
Yes.
then they call it the Christmas blues, right?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And that's emblemized beautifully in the wheel of the zodiac as we transition from Sagittarius, which is ruled by Jupiter, as you know, and is full of faith, into cold, inhibited Capricorn, materialistic,
That's
earthy
right.
Capricorn.
Of course, yes, and on a personality level, those are really very clearly borne out. The fire of the one and then the bummer of the other. But I really think that if we didn't get into this sort of societally dictated bustling around like we do and partying and going out when it's so cold, right? Or it's sort of just the opposite of what our karmic memory tells us should be done at this time of year. I think that we exacerbate this disconnect you were talking about. I mean, I think that this existential sense of doom would still be there underneath the surface of the holiday gaiety because, like we were saying earlier, that sense of imminent death has a reason for being there. It's actually, very realistic. And then to have a faith that light's going to return, you have to have a sense of doom, or at least a glimmer of it, in order to have the opposite, which is a sense of rebirth.
Absolutely.
Because people they're not plugged into the meaning of it, so they just go out and party. And I think that the way they really feel inside, maybe instinctively, is so opposite what they're doing that that's what creates depression.
That makes a lot of sense. It's almost as if you think you can party your way away from the holiday blues, but the fundamental dissatisfaction is still going to be there once the hangover lifts.
And it makes it worse if you've been doing the opposite of what your deep animal intelligence wants. But I also think that we have to grapple with mortality, Stephen, and in the old system of astrology, Capricorn was the planet of death before Pluto was sighted in the sky in 1930 and we got into the modern outer planets. Saturn, which rules Capricorn, were the symbols in astrology of dying and mortality, and it's still connected with aging. So that's another part of the letdown, like that you were talking about, that people all instinctively feel when Sagittarius moves to Capricorn.
Right. It's so interesting to me. I don't pretend to know much about Eastern religions, but I've heard about these Zen koans, which are sort of like little stories that contradict, that have a riddle in them designed to.
That's right.
And I think that in Western religions, Semitic religions like Judaism, Christianity, I think they build in a lot of paradoxes and contradictions to accomplish the same thing as the Zen koan. And one of these contradictions is, here we have Jesus, the Messiah, born in the sign of Saturn, the sign of the Capricorn goat. To me, that's just a big paradox.
Yeah, it is. There's also the point of view, though, that it wasn't really the birth of Jesus so much as him being a Piscean figure, and that the early church fathers, when they were trying to establish their version of Christianity as the only church in town, as a political activity, they decided to use all this energy that had been circulating around the winter solstice for eons, and to sort of rename it as the birth of Jesus. So it was kind of a co-opting that was very probably deliberate, whereas you were saying earlier that Jesus is really more associated with the archetype of Pisces, not Capricorn at all.
I see what you're driving at. You're saying the early church fathers probably relocated the birthday to align it with the solstice.
Well, they had this tendency to do that with all the pagan festivals. They had this pattern everywhere in the world of taking advantage of the particular turning points in the wheel of the year, like we were talking about, the seasonal juncture points that had been honored since time immemorial with festivals and deep connection in the human spirit. And they converted these festivals into the new holidays like Easter and Christmas. And they built the cathedrals on the same locations many times of those ancient ritual grounds. Have you ever heard that? Underneath the main cathedrals like Chartres and, well, all of them, the ones in England are the ones I'm most familiar with, they had, they will find burial mounds and prehistoric temples remains underneath the foundations of all these old churches in Europe, because once again they were taking advantage of the fact that those places, even locationally, had built up associations over years and years with these sacred ideas.
It's very interesting. We can't escape from either the Christian idea of redemption in Jesus, or also the mythology of Capricorn, which I read up about this before the show, actually has all of the Olympian gods fleeing from Typhon, and one of the gods, I want to say it was Pan. Pan changes into a fish goat and saves Zeus from being chopped up by Typhon. So there's again this sense of redemption, being saved. I think it's very important to the holiday as itself. What are your thoughts on this need to be saved, and how does it clash with the brawls that we see on Black Friday?
Yeah, that Typhon stuff is rich. I didn't realize there was an actual fish goat in that myth. Is that right?
Oh yeah. I ran across a whole. The mythology of Capricorn is so rich. There are a lot of different stories wrapped up in Capricorn, and Typhon. We see him appear here as well, and he's a really bad guy.
From
so
typhoon. That's the etymology of typhoon, I imagine.
I would imagine so as well. He's sort of like the devil in the Hellenistic world, right? The Typhon.
It is. That's right. And, the Babylonian roots of the astrology that we practice in the West in modern times has these analogs in all these other spiritual traditions. Like you say, any society that had goats is going to, use it as a symbol. And in the Western Hellenistic tradition, they got into goats as being licentious. And then that made him a good shoe-in for part of the symbolism of the devil when they got into the devil myth. So, but you have these universal roots, something that Joseph Campbell was proud to tell us, that, these recurrent images come up. And redemption, it's one of them. And I think it has to do with what we were talking about before at its root, which is you can die, but you will be reborn, which the old pagan view didn't see, of course, in Christian terms at all. It saw it in terms of the natural processes that people would notice, observe all around them in nature, that things don't go away forever. There really isn't any permanent state at all, which is why the whole Christian idea of heaven and hell must have been such nonsense to the early people when they tried to shove Christianity down the throats of people who had been living in nature. And, they tried to explain to them that if you broke the church fathers' rules, you would go to this permanent state of punishment. And if you didn't, you'd go to this permanent state. The idea that it was static, either way, heaven or hell was static and unchanging, completely violates the most essential tenet of nature, which is that everything changes.
Right.
And astrology which is that everything keeps moving.
Absolutely.
So I think that there was a huge contrivance there that must have just seemed very weird to the pagans who were tried to be brought round.
There's another dichotomy that's interesting too. The church figures, and this isn't just in Christianity, it's also in Islam. They see the heaven and hell split as being very carnal. Like you said, static, permanent, but also very carnal. You're either going to get, rivers of milk and honey, virgins, or you're going to get, fire and brimstone. And I think also to the ancient mind, this was also a violation, because Christmas says your material is going to evaporate into dust and start over again, but you're going to check out here.
I think it's a very good point. That the natural world, the pagan who observed his animals giving birth in the spring and then dying and then using the hide and the hoofs and everything, every part of the animal afterwards, so that was a kind of rebirth. Everything got recycled. Pluto governs the idea of recycling. And so when I say Pluto's natural law, I'm talking about that business that really Einstein said in his way, that energy can never be created or destroyed. It just changes form.
Right.
And I think that way back before the three sky god religions took over and put their own trippy visions of how life worked, tried to wipe out the more obvious natural understandings that everything in nature keeps moving, keeps getting recycled. You know how the church outlawed to even talk about reincarnation?
Yes.
It even had it's so insane, isn't it, when you think about it in context, that it even made it a heresy to suggest that death itself was natural. If you suggested that death was a natural, inevitable thing, that was blasphemy. So talk about being out of touch.
Absolutely, and it's unnatural, to say the least. The ancient mind would have been repulsed by an idea such as that.
They must have just been baffled by a lot of these weird precepts that the church came up with. So I can't see it in any other way but that it was an enormous power play. If you can get people disbelieving suddenly in reincarnation and insist that, no, the truth is that you have to buy into our laws and go through a priest to do it, and you can't get saved from this everlasting torture unless you pay your tithes and do what we say. What a political coup that was.
Well, I tell you, Jessica, as we approach the end of our show here, I want to ask you about that favorite Dutch elf, and I want to know how all of this we're talking about sort of transformed into this Dutch elf who would do a B&E in your house, and I'm sorry, as we approach the end of the interview here, we still have an hour left of the show. But yeah, Santa Claus. What's up with Santa?
Yeah, it's hilarious the way you put it in context. Did you happen to see that Jon Stewart show on the Comedy Central last week about that?
I missed it. I like him too.
He was referring to some Megan Fox. No, it's Fox News, but it was Megan Kelly or something. One of the Fox people was offended by what she considered a politically correct war on Christmas trip by suggesting that Santa was anything other than an old fat white man with a white beard. And she said, Santa is white. He just is. You can't change reality. Jon Stewart was saying, reality? Has anyone told Megan that he's a mess? Because Megan hadn't heard that one yet.
Well, we don't want to disparage Megan. We don't want to disrupt anybody's belief.
It depends on whose belief it is, right? She was saying, even if it makes people uncomfortable, you just have to accept Santa is white. And of course, Stewart was saying, it makes who uncomfortable? You don't care if people of color are made uncomfortable by that. So this points up a response to your question,
Right.
which is the reminder that cultures fashion pictures and stories that mimic whatever
Yeah.
the dominant thought pattern is at the time.
And Santa's kind of like the godson, isn't he? An old white man with a big long white beard.
Santa's the myth of choice, sort of the
Absolutely, the myth
one
of
that
choice.
that has caught the collective imagination in this particular, very brief time, though. He hasn't been around that long. What is eternal, though, are the natural cycles. You know, kings can come and go, and religions can come and go, but nature is forever.
That's a comforting thought. Absolutely a comforting thought, Jessica. And you know what? What better way to conclude than on that? Nature will endure, definitely. Jessica, I really wanted to thank you for coming on our show tonight. As always, it's a
It's been
pleasure
an
to have you.
absolute pleasure. A lovely way to celebrate the solstice.
Well, I hope you have a wonderful holiday season this year.
You too, Stephen. Everybody listening,
All right. Thanks again, Jessica.
you're welcome.
Hello, my name is Res Miranda. If you're having relationship, career, or life issues, I'm inviting you to experience what it's like to have access to professional, highly accurate psychics and spiritual advisors you can trust to care and help you. Register now to get your free 6-minute reading by telephone or chat. Get answers, get access, psychic access, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. PsychicAccess.com.
Very interesting. I think we forget how important the sun was to ancient peoples who really had
Oh my gosh.
modern
Yeah.
science. I mean, how did we know back then, if we lived then, that the sun was going to come back from day to day? We had no scientific guarantee
I
that the
think
sun.
that is such a good point.
You
You
know-
know, I think that's the root of this business of hope and faith that you hear about in Christianity surrounding Christmas. It's really the hope that the light will return. Because like you say, in the pre-modern world, they didn't have their little digital calendars and their little smartphones to tell them that there was any certainty at all that life was going to continue. And winter pretty much meant death, unless you were
Right.
prepared, for denizens of the northern hemisphere. And I think that also the physical and psycho-spiritual withdrawal into the cave during winter and moving slowly and conserving what you'd put by, waiting for the light to return. I think it all had this biological reality of winter that we've lost, but that they used to celebrate. And you're right. I mean, how could you not celebrate Yule if it was the moment when a dead world was going to be redeemed by this glorious return to life?
Well, you
I
once
think people still
described
feel
you
it.
once, you once described the winter solstice to me in a really wonderful way. The light getting ready to pivot, and seeing as how the winter solstice appears to be the sort of agent that makes Christmas special for everybody. You know,
Yeah.
Yule or whatever holiday you celebrate. What is the solstice for those of us who might not
Yeah.
know?
Well, it comes from sol is the root, which is sun, and sistere is Latin for to stand still. So solstice is when the sun seems to stand still, when it seems to pause before turning around. It's all a geocentric illusion, you know. It's what humans perceive from Earth's point of view.
Tonight, as I said, we have with us Jessica Murray, an astrologer, author, cultural commentator. She's highly regarded for her mastery of astrologer, and you can visit her at www.mothersky.com, where you can discover the innovative Skywatch service, which lets you track current cosmic conditions and plan your day accordingly. Jessica's the author of Soul Signation and At the Crossroads, and she has contributed to an anthology called Transpersonal Astrology. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Jessica. Hi, how are you?
Hello, Stephen. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. Welcome back to Psychic Viewpoint.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
Well, we certainly have a lot to cover tonight, so let's go ahead and hop into it. Let's start out with Christmas itself. What are its origins?
Wow.
That's a big
Yeah,
question.
I mean, this is a holiday everybody feels, isn't it? Despite, you know, all the clashes about belief systems. But you know that astrology looks at these things as based on natural cycles. So for us, it all boils down to what the seasons were doing. And the original holidays were festivals that marked specific seasonal shifts, you know, in the northern hemisphere anyway, that divided up the year. And they were all based on agriculture. They used an agricultural reference point. And so, you know, they used nature, and they had some things that were eternal for them. They used the sky as their main calendar. And they had I'm thinking particularly of the Wheel of the Year in the Celtic tradition, where Yule was the winter solstice when the sun was born. And, you know, S-U-N, the sun started its cycle to come back, and heat and light began to increase again. And somewhere along the line, you notice it got turned into a sun, S-O-N, in some stories that got told about the solstice, like the Christian one. But that's where the meaning lies in this view. It's what appears to us to be reality. So, in an astronomical sense, the solstice, the winter solstice, is when the relative yearly path of the sun perpendicular to the horizon stops and reverses direction. It's gone progressively further south of the equator, further and further, and when it reaches that most southerly point, that's when winter officially begins, again in the northern hemisphere. And we start to get this sense of the period of darkness turning into light. And we honor it as the shortest day of the year because it's that turning point. But you know, what's interesting to astrologers, more than the astronomy of it, and to anybody who does ritual, is that it's also a turnaround in an esoteric sense, because light is symbolic of consciousness.